Hi guys, today we're going to think about the second great lesson, which we learned last week. We learned about the formation of the earth. And today I want you to think about that. I'm going to show you a tool to kind of measure how long all of that took, because it's hard to even think about how long it took because it was a really, really, really long time. So I'm going to show you a clock, and this is just a regular clock. We're used to seeing this clock. So we see our second hand. Our second hand moves the fastest, and our second hand takes 1 minute to get all the way around the clock, right? And then we have our minute hand, which moves slower than the second hand. And our minute hand takes an hour to get all the way around the clock. And then we have our hour hand, which moves the slowest. And our hour hand takes 12 hours to make it all the way around the clock. So this is the clock that we're familiar with. We're familiar with these hands, but what if there was a hand that went even slower than the hour hand and it took like a whole year to go around the clock? What if there was a hand that went even slower than that and it was a decade hand and it took 10 years to get around the clock? Imagine how slow it would take if we had a century hand that took 100 years to make it all the way around that clock. So today I'm going to show you a different kind of clock that has a different hand on it, right? What if there was a clock that had a hand that started when the earth formed and is just finishing? Imagine how long it would take for that hand to move around this clock. So this clock is the clock of eons, and it starts when the earth formed. This is our eon hand. So an eon is the longest measurement of time. It's millions of years. So this clock represents millions and millions of years from when the earth started forming here. So the earth formed 4,500,000,000 years ago. So if we take that number and we divide it by 12, then each of these numbers represents 375 million years. So each number to get from the 12 to the 1 takes 375 million years. And to go from the 1 to the 2 takes 375 million years, which is a really, really long time. And this would be moving really, really, really slowly, right? So we can use this clock to think about the history of the earth, how long it took when the earth formed and what was happening, right? We can pretend like we're geologists or like scientists that study the earth. And we can use this clock to help us think about the history of the earth. If you think about the earth's formation and the history of it, the only way we know anything is from fossils, right? Because there weren't people around and there weren't cameras around. So the only way that we really know about the Earth's history is by looking at fossils. And there are fossils that are very old. Some of the very first bacteria that formed, we can have we can look at fossils of that. Some of the very oldest life forms, we can look at different fossils of those. So these fossils teach us about what was living on the Earth millions of years ago, what kind of life forms, what kind of plants, what the climate was like or the weather was like back then. So fossils really tell us a lot about the Earth's formation. So we are going to use our clock here and we're going to look at the different times in the Earth's history here. So our first eon, it's hard to see on this, I know, because it's reflecting, but you can see this black part. It starts on the 12 and it goes to right before the 2. This is our first eon, and this is called the Haitian Eon. It started 4,500,000,000 years ago when the Earth formed, and it went until about 3,800,000 years ago. So during the Haitian Eon, it was the first eon, the Earth was still really, really, really hot, right? It started with that Big Bang, and while the Earth was forming, it was just volcanoes erupting everywhere and asteroids hitting the Earth and this molten lava all over the surface of the Earth, right? So it was too hot for anybody to live there. And this is what an artist thought the Earth might have looked like during the Haitian Eon. So if we look at this, imagine what that was like. Imagine how hot it was like on the Earth, right? the earth was super hot. There was no ozone to protect the earth from the sun. So it was super hot. There was just this molten rock and lava everywhere, volcanoes erupting, asteroids hitting the earth, right? Nothing could live there yet. And then the earth slowly started to cool, and we move into the next eon here. You can see it starts right before the 2, and this one ends right after the 5. So this eon is called the Archaeon Eon, and it went from 3,800,000 years ago to 2,500,000 years ago. So during the Archaeon Eon, the Earth's crust started to cool enough for there to be oceans to form. The Earth's crust was really thin, and tiny little life forms called bacteria showed up during the Archaeon Eon. It was still hot and it was still wet, but it was cooler than it was here in the Haitian Eon. So we were able to have some life start to form, and the ocean started to form. So this is what an artist thought the Archaeon Eon might have looked like. And it definitely looks a lot better than the Haitian Eon. It looks a lot cooler, doesn't it? So as we move through the Archaeon Eon, it's a little bit longer than the Haitian, but it goes here until right after the 5. And then this blue area, you can see that's the biggest part on our clock, right? So that's going to be the longest eon. So the Proterozoic Eon started 2,500,000,000 years ago, and it went all the way until 540 million years ago. So this lasted a super long time. Remember how slow our eon hand moves. Each of these represents 375 million years. So it's moving very slowly. So the Proterozoic Eon was when the Earth's crust thickened. We got a lot of new life forms. So the blue-green algae started forming where it could feed itself and it could also make oxygen. So the oxygen amount rose from 1% to 15% in the atmosphere during the Proterozoic Eon. So this was a long eon with lots of change. The Earth just continued to cool. So this is what an artist thought the Earth might have looked like during the Proterozoic Eon. So we're getting some new life forms, and it's still all in the water. We have our algae and just some different kinds of life forms in the water. And that is represented by this blue part, and it takes a long time to get through there. That's our longest eon. And then after that, we move into the last eon here, and that is the Phanerozoic Eon. That went from 540 million years ago, and it goes all the way until the present. And so many things were happening during the Phanerozoic Eon that we actually break it up into eras. So during the Phanerozoic Eon, so many new life forms were happening and coming that we break it up into eras. So during the first part here, you can see this little kind of blue section up here. This represents the Paleozoic Era. So the Paleozoic Era is when sea life really started evolving. We were getting all kinds of new different animals living in the sea. And then towards the end of that, animals started moving onto the land. So during this brown part here, you can see that represents the Mesozoic Era, which is also called the Age of Reptiles. And that's when the dinosaurs really started coming. So during this time, we had a lot of new types of animals too, lots of reptiles. We still have our sea life and our reptiles. Then we move into this green part. The green part is the Cenozoic Era. And that's when mammals and birds started coming and evolving and flowering plants. So see how tiny that little green part is there? There's not a lot of time that mammals have been around on the earth. So this is what an artist thought that the Phanerozoic Era might have looked like. So you can see that there's all kinds of different birds. During this looks like it's the age of the reptiles, right? Dinosaurs. So during that Phanerozoic Era, there was all kinds of new life, sea life, reptiles, and then mammals and birds. And then can you see this tiny little red part right here? See the tiny, tiny, tiny part? Can you guys guess what that part is? That tiny red spot is when humans came onto the earth. So can you imagine that all of this happened all of these years, we had the Haitian Era, the Archaeon Era, the Proterozoic Era, and the Phanerozoic Era. And all of that happened before humans even came onto the earth. I know it's hard to imagine how slow this hand moves. And I know it's hard to imagine 375 million years between each number, but that's what this clock helps us do. It helps us to see how slow that time really was and what a small amount of time humans have spent on the earth compared to everything else. So this week we're going to work on looking at those eons and the eras, and you guys might find one that you're really interested in and find some more information out about it.